Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's so nice to see you joining us, and we're watching the numbers rise as you filter in. Welcome. We are so thrilled to be here with you this evening for another Emily Dickinson Museum virtual program. The museum does remain closed at this time in response to the pandemic, and we are missing all of you. But it has been great fun these last few months to be reaching out to our fans and followers around the world who might otherwise not have been able to travel to Amherst to sit in Emily Dickinson's parlor for a program like this one. So welcome to all of you, and especially if you are new to Emily Dickinson Museum virtual programming. We're so glad you could join us. My name is Brooke Steinhauser. I'm the program director at the Emily Dickinson Museum. You might also be seeing Elizabeth Bradley, who is our education programs manager. Hi. And we at the museum thank you for tuning in tonight. We hope that you and yours are well. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I'll just mention that we can't see you or hear you who are in our webinar this evening, but we really appreciate you being our audience tonight. We thank you for your support, and we hope that you will still engage with this program by typing your questions or your comments in the Q&A box. And you can do this at any point during the webinar. We have allotted plenty of time after Martha's reading to field your questions. And so tonight is the chance that you've been waiting for to pick the brain of Emily Dickinson's most recent biographer. So it's very exciting. If you're looking for how to find that, you should see a little Q&A with 2 dialog boxes down at the bottom of your tools there. And if you're following along on Facebook, you can also post a question there or a comment, and we will do our best to get to those as well. Let's see, our full program should last just about 1 hour, by the way. So now I am delighted to introduce our guest this evening, and I must tell you all that we had initially planned to hold this program back on March 29th at the museum. And when we had to postpone due to COVID, Martha very cheerfully recommended a more auspicious date, August 16th, 2020, which is, of course, today, and is precisely 150 years to the day that Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Emily Dickinson met for the first time ever in the Dickinson family homestead parlor. So we are just so delighted to be convening virtually with Martha today, and we will all just imagine ourselves sitting together in Emily Dickinson's parlor. Dr. Martha Ackmann is a journalist and an author who writes about women who have changed America. Her essays and columns have appeared in the New York Times, Paris Review, and the Atlantic. She also is a frequent commentator for New England Public Radio, has been featured on CNN, National Public Radio, and the BBC. Martha's award-winning books include The Mercury 13, The True Story of 13 Women and the Dream of Spaceflight, Curveball, The Remarkable Story of Toni Stone, first woman to play professional baseball in the Negro League, and of course, These Fevered Days, which you'll hear about in a moment. A longtime member of the Gender Studies Department at Mount Holyoke College, Martha taught a popular seminar on Emily Dickinson in the Poets House, which of course we know is today the Emily Dickinson Museum. And she is the recipient of fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. She holds a BA from Lindenwood College, an MA from Middlebury College's Bread Loaf School of English, and a PhD from University of Massachusetts. And we're so lucky because she lives right here in Western Massachusetts, where the Emily Dickinson Museum is located. Today, she is here to read from her new book, Fevered Days, 10 Pivotal Moments in the Making of Emily Dickinson, which just came out in February of this year from Norton. And in this book, she unravels the mysteries of Dickinson's life through 10 days that distill her evolution as a poet. So following Dickinson through her religious crisis while a student at Mount Holyoke, her exhilarating frenzy of composition, her startling decision to ask a famous editor for advice, and we're going to hear more about that today, her anguished letters to an unidentified master, her lifelong friendship with writer Helen Hunt Jackson, and her despair in confronting possible blindness. So this book utilizes thousands of archival letters and poems, as well as never before seen photos, to construct a remarkable map of Emily Dickinson's inner life and provide new insights into Dickinson's wildly original poetry. Martha, thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure, Brooke. Thank you so much for inviting me on this day that those of us who are deep into Emily Dickinson recognize as one of the most important in her life. Great to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're so glad to have you. I know that you're planning to share with us a chapter of your book today that you told me was one of your favorite chapters to write. I'd love to hear you tell us why that is the case. And also, before you begin your reading, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your unique storytelling style, because you employ something called narrative nonfiction. And as I understand it, it requires a tremendous amount of research. Tell us more.
Well, first to the, I guess the question about narrative nonfiction. It goes by many names: literary nonfiction, creative nonfiction, new journalism, sometimes people call it. And it uses the techniques of storytelling to tell a true story. So it requires, as you say, a lot of reporting. And I cut my chops in journalism initially, and still see myself as in part a journalist. And I love digging up details. So when it comes to telling this story in this particular moment, it meant trying to imagine as deeply and as vividly as I could about what might have happened, and then track down the facts to see what indeed did. Let me give you some examples of it. You mentioned that this was my favorite chapter to write, and that is because I had the goods. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Dickinson's literary mentor, who she had not met until this moment, did me, and more importantly, did history a great favor, and that he took very detailed notes on what Dickinson said during this meeting. Not only what she said, but how she said it, what she looked like, the tone of her voice. So I had a couple of letters that Higginson wrote his wife, both immediately after meeting her and then after some reflection, that just provided all of these rich details that I could work from. You know, a narrative nonfiction writer always wishes there were more letters like that you could use. So when you hear quotes in this chapter of things that Dickinson said, I'm not making them up. I'm using them from Higginson's letter. And then a couple of other things. As I said, I tried to imagine what it was like for Higginson to walk down the street from the hotel in the center of Amherst where he was staying to the Dickinson Museum. So I went to the Jones Library and I looked up maps of what the stores were at that time. And I found out that the local newspaper always put a copy of the most recent edition in the window. I knew that there was a demonstration of a thrashing machine. I knew that tar was being poured. This all comes from not only the Jones Library archives, but the local newspapers that Dickinson would have read. And then I won't go on too much longer, but just one more example. It was something that runs throughout the whole book. I wanted to know about the weather. I wanted to know what the weather was like on the day that Higginson visited. And for each chapter in my book, I used the weather records of Ebenezer Snell, an Amherst original who was a professor at Amherst College, and just a kind of wonderful wacko about weather. He kept detailed records. 3 times a day, he'd go out and record what the weather was like in Amherst. He only lived about a mile plus from where Emily Dickinson was. So I had that weather report, and it was a day of about 70 some degrees, much as we're having here in Amherst today. And so I wove that together too. So weather records and maps of the town, and even letters that reported what kind of stride Thomas Wentworth Higginson had. All of those things are part of the toolkit that I used to create the chapter.
Thank you. Yeah, I always wondered, do you think Higginson recorded such detail about other meetings that he had, or was there something about this particular meeting that...
Well, that's a good question. And I have to say, I haven't read all of Higginson's collected letters. I did read of his Civil War journals and many, many letters, but not everything that has been collected. But it seemed to me that he had a sense that this was an unrivaled moment. And I say later on in the chapter that it's my reading that he had had a sort of a premonition that he was writing not only to his wife, but writing for a wider audience as well. And that might have been history.
Yeah. I wonder if you can prepare us for the day that we're about to enter into with you. What has preceded this day in Emily Dickinson and Thomas Wentworth Higginson's relationship? Where are we at?
That's a good question. So we are 8 years into their correspondence, the letters between them. On April 15th, 1862, Dickinson took the most unprecedented step of her life and selected 4 poems to send to this complete stranger. Although she knew him by reputation, he was a literary man. And in the most, I think, the most important letter in American literary history, she sends this letter to him saying, "Mr. Higginson, are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive?" I've always loved that first sentence, and I think it says just boatloads about Emily Dickinson, because she doesn't ask him, "Are you too busy to say if my verse is publishable, if it's any good, if it's intellectually rich?" She says alive, and that has everything to do with Dickinson's definition of poetry, which you'll also hear a little bit more about in this chapter. So they began writing. And then life interceded, and Thomas Wentworth Higginson became a colonel in the Union Army during the American Civil War. Dickinson encountered eye difficulties, something that sent her to Boston on 2 different occasions to be treated for an eye disorder. And then they tried time and time and time again to meet in person. And it just didn't work out. One of my favorite things is that Higginson kept kind of teasing out what he thought would be interesting opportunities for you. "Don't you want to come to Cambridge? I'm going to go to a musical event that I think that you might enjoy." And finally, in what to me reads like a moment of exasperation, he said, "Don't you need sea air?" And apparently she didn't. I mean, she was perfectly happy and amorous. But an occasion provided itself, and in 1870, after 8 long years of corresponding, of becoming closer, of Higginson reading more of her poetry, of finding out that she had published some things, they finally meet. So you can imagine Dickinson, who is 39, well into her seclusion, is waiting for this man that knows so much about what is closest to her in all the world, and that is her work, her poetry, and inviting her into her home. And you can just imagine the trepidation. There's something else that comes up in the chapter, and that they got their dates wrong. And Higginson thought she said Monday, and Dickinson said no, Tuesday, the 16th. So I just love that human tidbit, in that for 24 hours, Emily Dickinson, America's greatest literary recluse, is waiting for somebody who doesn't show up. So they finally got that squared away, and on that Tuesday of August 16th, on a day of about 74 degrees, they meet for the first time.
I thought I might just take a moment before we begin your reading, just to share the text of the letter. This is from an earlier chapter of Martha's book, which was another pivotal day having to do with Higginson, which Martha has just described, which is the moment that Emily decides to reach out to this perfect stranger, who is a mover and shaker in the world of literature and of publishing. And she wrote, as Martha has begun, "Mr. Higginson, are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive? The mind is so near itself it cannot see distinctly, and I have none to ask. Should you think it breathed, and had you the leisure to tell me, I should feel quick gratitude. If I make the mistake that you dared to tell me, would give me sincere honor toward you. I enclose my name, asking you, if you please, sir, to tell me what is true. That you will not betray me, it is needless to ask, since honor is its own pawn." So with that, let's fast forward 8 years. And Martha, will you share that chapter with us?
Sure. And boy, did she fudge the truth in that letter.
She really does.
I have none to ask. Baloney.
Absolutely.
She had editors asking for her work. She had her sister-in-law, Sue. She
She had been published.
She had been published, right? She just presents herself as this novice. But now Higginson is going to see the real deal. And some of that posing will slide away. So I'm not going to read the whole chapter because that would take a very long time, but I'm going to jump in about a third of the way into it with the visit itself. So it's August 16th, Tuesday, as we said, day of about 76 degrees and cloudy. Mr. Higginson's visit would be no ordinary call for Emily, not that she received many guests. Since her beloved dog Carlo had died, Emily seemed different. Without her silent companion beside her, she stayed indoors and was more reclusive. The great literary productivity of the Civil War years had tapered off. She also stopped collecting her poems into stitched booklets, later called fascicles, and new poems remained unbound in loose sheets. There continued to be revisions to some of the 1,100 poems she already had written. There would always be revisions, but urgency no longer propelled her. She had practical reasons for writing fewer poems. Losing the family's maid, Margaret O'Brien, to marriage in 1865 placed more household demands on all the Dickinson women. But other changes were evident beside the number of poems she was writing. She was more patient, less insistent. She was more forgiving of perceived slights. Although others around her were busy with their own lives, she did not feel as forsaken as she once had. When her sister-in-law, Sue, gave birth to a daughter, Martha, born in 1866, Emily did not pester Sue with notes seeking attention. She showed similar acceptance of her brother Austin's many town involvements. One night in the dark, she accompanied her brother across the street to admire the new First Church building, a construction project that had consumed Austin for years. Even Emily's aging parents were absorbed in their own new callings that she noted with pleasure rather than rejection. Emily Norcross Dickinson delighted in her two grandchildren, and Edward joined Colonel William Clark, working to start an agricultural college in Amherst. Emily's sense of self made the difference. She knew who she was. Her sister Vinnie once observed that Emily's primary job was to think. She was the only one of us who had that to do, Vinnie said. Emily no longer was hoping to make her family proud, as she once told Sue. The hundreds of poems and fascicles and sheets hidden away in her room bore witness to what she already had accomplished. One had only to look at her to see the maturity. Her russet hair, once the object of girlhood impulsiveness, first long, then cut short, had settled into permanence, parted in the middle and pulled back in a knot. And there was her clothing, the fashionable fabric she once asked Austin to bring from Boston. The calicos, the colored cloth had given way to dimity. They were loose-fitting garments down to the ankles with lace trim, pearl buttons, and a pocket large enough for paper or a pencil. Words had shifted for her too. When she was young, she said words were cheap and weak. The exuberant valentines, the effusive letters to girlhood friends, but nothing had grown mightier to her now. Sometimes she would write a word and trace the outlines of its curves with her fingers. She said the words before her glowed. Emily had chosen deeper rather than more abundant sustenance, a life where, as she put it, she would eat evanescence slowly. Thomas Wentworth Higginson also noticed a change. In her letters, she no longer signed her name on a card, slipped in an envelope, a game played as much for effect as reticence. Largely gone too were the callow signatures of your gnome and your scholar. Now she often signed her name with a single word, Dickinson. That is who she had become. Colonel Higginson was excited and nervous about paying calls. As a boy, he was shy around women outside his family. To mitigate awkwardness, he would write down conversation topics. If tongue-tied, he would pull the paper from his pocket and select a matter to discuss. But Higginson had plenty of questions for Emily, chief among them, inquiries about her seclusion. In a letter before his visit, he had asked if Carlo's death had made her even more detached from society. It was difficult for him to understand how she could live so isolated. He certainly was awestruck by the extraordinary images that flooded her mind, but wondered if she paid a price for brilliance. It isolates one anywhere to think beyond a certain point or to have such luminous flashes as come to you, he said. At times, her talent made him reluctant to answer her letters, aware he never could match her artfulness. He was clumsy with words, he told her, and often missed the fine edge of her thought. But he forced himself to put aside timidity and continued to write, knowing what he could not offer in useful criticism, he might be able to offer in dependability, friendship, and generosity. Higginson thought she needed someone, a person who admired her, even if he did not always understand what she was saying. Sometimes, I take out your letters and verses, dear friend, he wrote, and when I feel their strange power, it is not strange that I find it hard to write and that long months pass. I have the greatest desire to see you, and always feeling that perhaps if I could take you by the hand, I might be something to you. But till then, you only enshroud yourself in this fiery mist, and I cannot reach you, but only rejoice in the rare sparkles of light. 8 years had passed since Emily had first asked Higginson if her verse was alive. That was a long time to wait before meeting each other face to face. The night before he was to arrive in Amherst, Emily dreamed all night, not of Higginson, but of his wife, Mary, a woman the poet had only heard of infrequently. Mary Higginson's spectral appearance puzzled Emily, and she was eager to share the dream, but she would have to wait 24 hours before telling Mr. Higginson. All day Monday, August 15, 1870, Emily expected him to arrive, but he did not. There had been a mix-up. He thought they had agreed on Tuesday, not Monday. The next day, when they both realized the error, Emily sent a kindly note up street to his Amherst House hotel. Dear friend, she wrote, I will be at home and glad. I think you said the 15th. The incredible never ceases to surprise us because it is incredible. With the day straightened out, Higginson prepared to meet her. To be honest, he was exhausted. He had spent the past year writing 2 books. The Atlantic Monthly serialized his first novel, Malbone, and then there was the upcoming book based on his Civil War diary. Living in Newport, Rhode Island had also lost its allure. He now found society life superficial and draining. Perhaps Emily knew better, after all, how to preserve the energy needed for creativity. The hotel Dickinson had suggested was convenient, 4 stories tall in the center of town with a dining room, a livery stable around the corner. It was not as hot as it had been that summer, but it was dry. Many town wells had dried up and the Connecticut River was low with brown banks stretching from shore. The town common looked terrible. Higgledy-piggledy, one embarrassed citizen said, with patches of grass, gravel pits, old frog holes and snakes. Near the common, a few workers were pouring tar. Amherst was putting in sidewalks, and one would run directly in front of Austin and Edward Dickinson's law office. The sounds Higginson usually heard, the clatter of Boston omnibuses, ships coming into dock at Newport's Narragansett Bay, were nowhere to be found. An unspeakably quiet town, Higginson thought. Calling card in hand, Higginson set out, walking toward the homestead in long, loping strides. Outside the hotel, new farm machinery was on display. Men listened to a salesman touting a thresher's efficiency. With a boy to turn and a man to feed, it could produce 100 bushels a day. Across the street, the Amherst Record newspaper office posted its current edition, a Peo tree, misspelled, column featured a verse by Bret Harte, and there was a lengthy article on growing corn. The best way to cultivate corn in New England, an expert reported, was to plow in the autumn and spread green manure in the spring. It was all about chemistry. A few steps further on, at Frank Wood's dining rooms, waiters served stewed oysters, a favorite of the local citizenry. Higginson passed a Chinese laundry, a harness shop, and Mr. Marsh's cabinet and coffin making establishment. He followed the road down a gentle slope until it leveled off near a copse of trees and the start of a wooden fence. The fence marked the beginning of the Dickinson property. First the Evergreens, Susan and Austin's stately home, then the Homestead, Edward Dickinson's manse. The walkway rose again as it approached the front steps, an not so inconsequential reminder of the family's prominence. Higginson took in the sight so he could tell his wife everything. A large house, like a country lawyer's, brick, flower and vegetable gardens to the east, an apple orchard, pears too. From where he stood, he could see the train depot and the distant line of the Pelham Hills. Mrs. Hunt, whom he had met earlier, used to laugh at how timidly Colonel Higginson would knock at her room in their boarding house. He knocks like a baby, she said, and then slides in edgewise. Higginson made no such hesitant entrance at the Dickinsons. He knocked, presented his card, and was ushered into a dark parlor on the left. Then he waited. First, he heard her. From upstairs on the second floor came the sound of quick, light steps, footsteps that sounded like a child. Then she entered, a plain woman with two bands of reddish hair, not particularly good looking, wearing a white piqué dress. The white stunned him. It was exquisite. A blue shawl covered her shoulders. She seemed fearful to him, breathless at first, and extended her hand, not to shake, but to offer something. These are my introductions, she said, handing him two daylilies. Forgive me if I am frightened. I never see strangers and hardly know what I say. Then Emily looked at him, dark-haired, whiskered, graceful. He looked kind. Higginson did not reach into his pocket to fish out a topic for conversation. He did not need to. Once Emily sat, she began talking and did not stop. When I first lost the use of my eyes, she told him, it was a comfort to me to think that there were so few real books that I could easily find someone to read me all of them. She wondered how people got through their days without thinking. How do most people live without any thought? She said, there are many people in the world. You must have noticed them on the street. How do they live? How do they get through their days? How do they put their clothes on in the morning? She was full of aphorisms, sentences that seemed to have been crafted earlier in her mind and that she wanted to share. Women talk. Men are silent. That is why I dread women. Truth is such a rare thing, and it's delightful to tell it. Is it oblivion or absorption when things pass from our minds? At times, Dickinson seemed self-conscious and asked Higginson to jump in, but every time he tried, she was off again, and words tumbled out almost uncontrollably. He tried to recall every phrase, every thought, her tone, her humor, asides. My father only reads on Sunday. He reads lonely and rigorous books, she said. Once she recalled her brother brought home a novel that they knew their father would not condone. Austen hid it under the piano cover for Emily to find. When she was young, she said, and read her first real book, she was in ecstasy. This, then, is a book, she had exclaimed. And are there more of them? She boasted about her cooking and said she made all the bread for the family, puddings too. People must have puddings, she said. The way she said puddings, so dreamy and abstracted, sounded to Higginson as though she were talking about comets. Emily said her life had not been constrained or dreary in any way. I find ecstasy in living, she explained. The mere sense of living is joy enough. When at last the opportunity arose, Higginson posed the question he most wanted to ask. Did you ever want a job? Have a desire to travel or see people? The question unleashed a forceful reply. I have never thought of conceiving that I could ever have the slightest approach to such a want in all future time. Then she larded on more. I feel I have not expressed myself strongly enough. Emily reserved her most striking statements for what poetry meant to her, or rather how it made her feel. If I read a book, and it makes my whole body so cold no fire ever can warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way? Emily was remarkable, brilliant, candid, deliberate, mystifying. After years of waiting, he was finally sitting across from Emily Dickinson of Amherst, and all he wanted to do was listen. Following goodbyes, Higginson walked down the granite steps and headed toward town. He needed to clear his head and let settle what had just happened. Before returning to his hotel for the night, he called once more. On the parlor table, he caught a glimpse of his nature book, outdoor papers, as well as his new novel. Emily had read everything he had written, even if she had not been subtle about acknowledging it. She must have felt more relaxed than earlier in the day and entered the parlor informally. Her mind was still on the family, and she still wanted to talk. I never had a mother, she said. I suppose a mother is one to whom you hurry when you are troubled. She spoke of her father, too, and shared a story about not knowing how to tell time. Higginson had hoped he could remember everything. Before he rose to leave, Emily placed a photograph in his hand. It was an image of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's grave, a memento a friend had brought back from Europe and who had presented it to her a few days before. He accepted the gift reluctantly, knowing it probably meant more to her than it would to him. Like the daylilies from earlier, he knew that the photographs was Emily's way of saying thank you. Gratitude, she said, is the only secret that cannot reveal himself. Higginson said he'd hoped to see her again sometime, and she abruptly interrupted him. Say in a long time, she corrected. That will be nearer. Sometime is nothing. With hundreds of thoughts whirling in his head, Higginson retraced his step back to the hotel, past the Chinese laundry and the oysters and the livery stable. He needed to go to bed, but before turning in, he compiled notes, trying to recall it all. I'm going to skip here a little bit. Go to Higginson leaving town. Before leaving town the next day, Higginson toured Amherst College, the dinosaur footprints that looked like scratches of ancient birds. He thought they looked a little bit like Dickinson's handwriting. On the train, he sat for a while with President Stearns of Amherst College, and they talked about Emily and her family. It was an all-day ride through Vermont and into New Hampshire, and Higginson could not stop thinking about Dickinson. He kept recalling her remark about puddings, her light step, and the imposing weight of her ancestral home. Higginson wrote additional notes and placed them in his valise for safekeeping. While he always tried to record his thoughts, he was especially concerned about capturing every particular about meeting this poet, his poet. It was as if he had a momentary glimpse into the future and could imagine generations of readers wanting to know more. He wrote his wife again and told her about running into Edward Dickinson before leaving town. Thin, dry, and speechless, he said. I saw what her life had been. Jostling along the tracks, miles from Amherst, he said Emily Dickinson had dazzled him, but had also made him uncomfortable. She was not capable of casual conversation, he said, or everyday friendship. It took every ounce of his being to meet her level of intellectual intensity. I never was with anyone who drained my nerve power so much. Without touching, she drew from me. I am glad not to live near her. When Higginson's train crossed into Vermont, he stared out the window and could barely make out the Connecticut River. Rocks and sandbars emerged where there once was rushing current. Passing through Brattleboro, he surveyed the fields. They were as brown as those in Amherst, and farmers were feeding hay. Yet, as dry as everything was, there was abundance. Dickinson recently bit into a pear that had hips like hams and the flesh of bonbons. Years earlier, when he'd been a young man, he had thought about becoming a farmer. Growing peaches had intrigued him, and he made several trips to Brook Farm to look at their methods of farming. Before he became a writer, he said he liked the idea of being closely connected to the seasons and imagined planting a tree, watching it grow, and picking its fruit, transforming peach slices into rich preserves. Down in Amherst, an editor prepared his copy for the next week's edition of the newspaper. This season, there will be a good crop of apples, he said. The New England Seven, as they were called, had names that were poetry themselves. Baldwin's, Delicious, Wealthy's, Gravenstein's, Rhode Island Greenings, Northern Spies, Mackintosh. Higginson never got around to asking Emily if she was interested in preparing a book of poetry like Helen Hunt was doing. Perhaps he couldn't find the nerve. Feeling that if he pressed too hard, Emily would withdraw, vanishing like those sparkles of light he always associated with her. But the man who never became a peach farmer knew there was a time to sow and a time to reap. For Emily Dickinson, the harvest was yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. I just, not only are you a beautiful and skilled writer, but you're also a wonderful reader of your.
Oh, thank you. I was jumping around there a little bit, so I hope you didn't see my.
Oh, I enjoy it every time I have the chance to hear it. And I understand that you also, you narrated the audiobook version of this.
I did. You know, I haven't narrated my other books, but this one was so personal to me. I wanted to do it. So we got it in just before COVID shut everything down. And I'm glad we were able to do that.
Yeah, yeah. So this is the time we have about 20 minutes left, during which Martha is keen to answer your questions. And I see that we have some rolling in. And if you haven't been able to add yours yet to the Q&A, I encourage you to do so now. I would like to begin by asking a question. You know, I think I wanted to make sure we shared the letter, the 1862 letter from Dickinson to Higginson, because something about it establishes who she is before these 8 years pass. And I think about this change over time that happens in us all, that of course was happening in Dickinson's life. In your book, you wrote, poetry, this is after you've talked about that letter, and you say that poetry had to affect the body, Emily believed, and trigger a visceral response, and she would never be content to reach only a reader's mind and heart. She wanted to touch bone and muscle and nerve. I think we find today at the museum that this is still the case with Emily Dickinson for contemporary readers. But we have a sort of historical view sometimes of Higginson that maybe he never felt that touch at his bone and his muscle and his nerve. Clearly she touched his nerve power, as he says, with her presence. But do you think that he felt that in her poetry that she shared with him over the years?
Yes, you know, there were a number of topics in Dickinson's life that I wanted to give my own interpretation on, that I felt was very important to give my own take on. I thought about these things long and hard, and I wanted to get them out there. And one was about Higginson, that I think that he has often been given a short shrift from critics, in that he didn't understand her. He didn't help her get her poetry published. And I think that's wrong-headed. My own view is that he did realize that she was writing brilliant poetry. I think if he didn't feel that way, he wouldn't have sustained the correspondence over the year. And I also think, as I mentioned in that excerpt I just read it, that at times he felt that he just couldn't completely understand her, that she was above him, which didn't make things bad. It made him work on it. But I think he rather quickly realized that he was not dealing with somebody who wanted help with this line of poetry, this kind of imagery that he could give corrections to. I think he rather quickly realized that she knew her own mind, and that one of the best things he could do was to give her time. And as I said, generosity, dependability, and friendship. And I think that was very important to Dickinson, and was the reason she said, "You were not aware that you saved my life." I don't take that so dramatically to mean that she was going to end her life, but I think it gave deeper meaning to her life, that she realized that there were people out there who knew a great deal about literature and writing, who viewed her as someone with a very serious talent.
Mm. So that, you know, she's aware that there are people out there with the power to help her achieve publication on her own terms if she wants. You shared in this chapter her very adamant response in 1870 to Higginson. You know, it could not be further from my mind, essentially, is what she is saying to him in 1870. An earlier chapter in your book is called Taller Feet, and makes reference to an exchange between Susan and Emily. Susan is Emily's sister-in-law, and this is in 1862, about one month roughly before she reaches out to Higginson, actually. And in which she essentially says, "If I could make you in Austin proud someday a long way off, 'twould give me taller feet." And then 1 month later, she reaches out to this man of letters. So do you think this is about change over time, or do you think this is something about a contrast between her relationship with someone like Susan versus someone like Higginson? I'd love to hear you speak to that sort of change in her.
The change being that she told Sue, "If I could make you proud, a great way off." Well, I think the pivotal phrase there is "a great way off," and not you know, right away by publishing things. Certainly, she was closer to Sue at that stage, and I think for all of her life, I don't think there was anyone more important to her than Sue. And I think she felt comfortable in sharing that ambition with her, we've been talking a lot about ambition on the national stage this past week, and Dickinson was ambitious, and nothing wrong about that. And so I think she shared that with Sue. But in that first letter to Higginson that you read, she's taking this different stance as this novice. I think she just didn't know, the ground that she stood on with him yet. She wanted to feel things out. But later the candor comes, and certainly in that meeting when she's talking nonstop, where he says it. He says he can't get a word in edgewise. I think he sees a woman with great drive, and again, someone who knew the contours of their own mind and who knew what she wanted to do with her work. And people occasionally ask me why, this is one of the fundamental questions in thinking about Emily Dickinson. Why didn't she publish? And I think it was because she never wanted a poem to leave her hands, that it was alive. And going back to your point about poetry must affect us viscerally. It must make us feel alive. It itself must be alive. And to have it set in print, to have it done, to have it exactly the way it was going to be for the end of time, that was something very hard to do. So in my reading, I think, why didn't Dickinson publish? Because she was constantly at work at it. I mean, she would go back to a poem sometimes eight years later and tweak it in some particular way. It was the work of her lifetime.
We have a listener who would love to know, you spoke of Emily Dickinson's ambition, and I think certainly that is a real theme of this book in the days that you chose. One of our listeners would love to hear a little bit more about ambition and some other examples of Dickinson's ambition.
Well, I think the greatest example of her ambition is that she wrote 1,789 poems in her lifetime. You compare that to other writers, Elizabeth Bishop, Robert Frost, Whitman, nowhere near. And so she was constantly at it. And to look at those years of high productivity that coincided with the war years, 1864, 1865 in particular. She is, even earlier, I should say, she's writing sometimes a poem a day. I think that words were just always, words and phrases were always traveling through her mind. I was texting with a friend this morning who had just finished my book, and she was asking me, she said Dickinson had what seemed to her such a tumultuous inner life. And I said, well, I think that's true. I think more thoughts traveled through her head. Higginson even suggests that in one of the lines I was reading from. And so I think she needed I think she needed a sort of, a controlled, calm environment around her. But back to the ambition, the number of poems she wrote, the fact that she began to collect them in an organized fashion in fascicles from the time she was in her early 30s. That she got mad at times at the way some of her poems were represented in print, that she wanted it in a particular way. And that there were many editors knocking on her door, from Sam Bowles, the editor of the Springfield Republican, to editors of journals in New York. And she withheld handing her work over. And again, I think that had something to do with wanting to continue to work at it. And I think the point about knowing her own mind, gracefully accepting suggestions to critique her poems from her sister-in-law, Sue, or Higginson, and never following them, never. Always knowing what she wanted, again, speaks to that confidence, that drive, and I think that ambition as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Another participant, Marcy, would really love to know. She likes to think that Dickinson knew how good she was. And do you believe that that Dickinson may have had this sense that she might be immortal?
Is that my friend Marcy Tanner from Texas?
Marcy Ewins.
Marciona. Okay. Also from Texas, I think. I know Marcy. Did Dickinson say it again? Did Dickinson?
Marcy thinks that Dickinson knew how good she was.
Oh yeah.
Do you agree with that? Do you think
Oh yeah. Yeah.
had this prescient sense
Yeah.
for her?
Yeah. Yeah, Marcy. And I think even as a young girl, she could even be a little bit smart alecky about it. That she knew, and I find that charming. You know, I find that deeply human. She was often called upon to read her essays when she was a young student at Amherst Academy, the equivalent of high school, and she knew she was better than others. There was a letter she writes where she talks about a young boy in her class gave just an awful paper that he read in front of the others, and she met him as they wound up their day reading their papers to their classmates, and kind of made a smart alecky response to him, and not very kind, as a matter of fact. So yes, I think she knew how good she was, and that gets at that gets at the point about knowing her own mind again too.
Some folks are curious, Martha, what your sense is of Dickinson's impressions of Higginson. This chapter is really rich with, of course, Higginson's impressions because we have that documentary record.
Yeah.
But what do you think her impressions were of him? Do you think that, to what extent do you think that Dickinson was aware of Higginson's progressive causes and his sort of support of other women writers?
There's nothing in the record that I can think of where Dickinson is speaking directly to his work as an abolitionist, a man who thought that times we needed to use violence in order to make the country what it should be. But in terms of progressive women writers, there's Helen Hunt. Helen Hunt was a girlhood friend of Dickinson's, lived just about a mile down the road from her. They lost track of each other in the kind of the middle part of their lives. And then Higginson ended up living in the same boarding house with Helen Hunt Jackson, or Helen Hunt, she was at that point. And Higginson brought the two women together. Now, Helen Hunt goes on to become one of the first champions of Native American rights in this country. So she certainly was aware of that, and thought highly of Helen Hunt and also Higginson. I'll say this: Higginson's much more progressive, liberal political stances were not in alignment with her father, but that did not keep Dickinson at all from continuing to write him, to seeing him as an important person, and inviting him to their home twice. He didn't write as much about the second visit as he did this one.
Yeah. Of course, Higginson's relationship to the Civil War is a fascinating other sort of chapter for our listeners to pursue on their own, to find his own writings. You have some folks interested in hearing more about how the Civil War influenced Dickinson's life and writing. Of course, you have a chapter, I think it's chapter 7, Bulletins All Day for Immortality, where you talk a bit about this.
Yeah, Higginson, I think one of the ways in which Dickinson was very keenly aware, obviously, of the Civil War was through Higginson, because they had begun to establish their letter writing when Higginson went off to the Union Army and became the first officer of a Black regiment on the Union side, who went down to the Carolinas. So they were continuing to write letters back and forth when he was wounded. She was aware of that. And a second thing was Dickinson was a great reader of the newspaper. I mean, a thorough, every single word reader of the newspaper. And Sam Bowles, who was editor of the Springfield Republican, another man of liberal stripes, first newspaper to endorse a political candidate when the Springfield Republican endorsed Lincoln. So she once wrote, she said, the news of battles is easier to take when Sam tells it, when she receives her words. She heard Amherst College and the town of Amherst soldiers marching on the town common. I mean, that was within earshot. I also came across a record, speaking of shots, where they were practicing firing guns, and she could hear that. I mean, it wasn't like Amherst was this isolated enclave in the North. There's a great line that there's much debate about in Dickinson's letters that said she had a terror since September. Lots and lots of people speculate on what that might be. And I have my own speculation, again, from reading the daily newspapers that I knew that Dickinson read religiously. It was in September when the Amherst Boys, the regiment of students and townsmen, left from the train depot from the Civil War. And they marched right under her window. And you know, I asked myself, can you hear from the train depot from what was going on from the Dickinson homestead? And you could, and there was, you know, quite commotion. Her father was always master of ceremony of everything. And she heard him giving what turned out to be a terrible speech that day, when he warned the soldiers of vices that they must avoid. And a minister sort of rescued him by saying the more appropriate things. So she had the vivid reminders of the war right in front of her face. And while Dickinson is a poet, so is always going to be speaking metaphorically, she's not going to use the words Antietam, Appomattox, Gettysburg. I think we see much in her poetry that deals with sacrifice, that deals with loss, that deals with the often inscrutable tides of history. And I could go on and on with that and talk a little bit more about the death of Fraser Stearns, the son of the Amherst College president, that affected her so deeply, and I think prompted that first letter to Higginson. But I won't. I see we're almost out of time.
Because folks can read more about that.
They can.
We have a number of folks who are very keen to hear from you. How on earth did you make these choices to find these 10 days? And were there moments that didn't make it in?
Yeah. Well, it was fun. Actually, I mean, there were just some givens. You have to do the visit from Higginson. You have to do Dickinson's letter to Higginson for the first time. I mentioned that I wanted to resurrect some people, or what I put a new spin on our understanding of them. And one of them was Mary Lyons, the principal of Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, where Dickinson attended. So I felt strongly about doing that. And then I asked lots of friends and Dickinson colleagues around the world what were some of their favorite things, and people would give me advice. I had one chapter that was supposed to go in. You know, you write a book proposal before you write a book and send it off to publishers, and one chapter that was in it dealt with Dickinson and Emerson. I am a great lover of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he was a member of something called the Saturday Club that was in Concord, Mass, that Dickinson's cousins belonged to. And I came across these great records of a meeting that was held at the Norcross cousins' homes, where the secretary reported they shared poems by someone of too shy a nature to be made public. I so wanted to include that chapter. No one has ever thought about Dickinson and Emerson, that kind of close proximity. The Alcotts were there. It was very heady company. But I realized that for the whole chapter, Dickinson would be off stage. You know, she wasn't at that meeting. And, you know, I don't think you can write a compelling book unless you have your subject on on stage, on the page about every 3 pages. So I scrapped that and did the chapter that dealt with Dickinson's eye problems instead.
Martha, I do like to keep to our time, but I think we have so many wonderful questions, and I want to end on one that's a little more personal for you. And this is a lovely one from, I believe, a friend of yours, who would really like to know, of all the poets that you read and learned about in school, all these years later, what is it about Dickinson that continues to speak to you, maybe that you think continues to speak to the world?
Well, I'll go back to the day I first encountered Dickinson, which I remember, and it sounds like I'm making this up, but I didn't. I'm not. I encountered Dickinson when I was a 16-year-old student in high school, and we read the poem "After Great Pain, a Formal Feeling Comes," and I understood not a whit of it. And it's one of the reasons why I've never. I hope I succeeded in this in my teaching. I never asked a student what's a poet, what a poem is about. I don't think that's the way you go to it. And I read that poem, and while I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explicate it in the way that you do in English classes. Something deep inside me clarified. I'll say I couldn't explain it, but I could understand it. And I think that is at the very heart, at least for me, of Emily Dickinson's genius, that she is able to do what she set out to do, and that is to hit us in our bodies, in our soul, in the muscle and the nerve and the sinew, and that she is able to, as she said, make the words alive. So it is that visceral response to the poetry that grabbed me when I was 16 years old, and that continues to grab me today. That Dickinson is transporting, and in ways sometimes that we can't put words to, but that we know are true.
Martha Ackmann, this has just been an absolute delight. I have a feeling that you and I and all of our participants this evening could go on for several hours more. And I wish we could. I've really enjoyed all these questions coming in, and thank you so much to all of you for your participation tonight, to our audience for tuning in on the webinar and on Facebook. A big thank you to the amazing Martha Ackmann. Please do visit her website to learn more about her work and to buy this very gorgeous book. You will not be sorry. This is a fabulous read. And the links to her webpage and to finding your copy of the book are on the Emily Dickinson Museum's event webpage. Martha, if our friends want to find you on social media, how can they do that?
Thank you. And let me just say, Brooke, I could not have written this book without the people at the Emily Dickinson Museum who answered my every question and got me up into the attics and down into the cellar. And so it's just a treat and a thrill to be with my good friends from the museum. You can find me on Fevered Days on Instagram, on Martha Ackmann on Twitter. And the best place to look for me is on my professional Facebook page, and that is Martha Ackmann Books. And that has the most current listing of additional readings that I'm doing and where I'll be appearing. And I'd love to have people check in with me there. It'd be grand.
We hope that you all will join us again soon for another Emily Dickinson Museum virtual program. We have more coming up. We have in early September, on September 3rd, our monthly First Thursday poetry reading series continues. And then later in the month, we are bringing the Tell It Slant Poetry Festival to a screen near you. And we're so excited. Our headliners this year include Jericho Brown, Ada Limon, and Franny Choi. So for full information about that and other programs, or to sign up for our monthly mailing or to make a donation, you can visit us at emilydickinsonmuseum.org. Martha Ackmann, thank you so much again. Oh, here comes Maud. The program's almost over. And until we see you all again, we hope that you will take good care of one another. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, Martha.
Bye-bye. Good to be with you.
Bye-bye, everybody.